All right, welcome everyone. We have an incredible turnout for this webinar, so we're going to make it worth your while and cover as much of the evolving legal landscape as we can, while also saving some time for questions at the end. And to that end, please post your questions as you have them in the Q&A box. I think you'll see it towards your bottom right-hand corner, but there should be a Q&A box. Post them as you've got them, and we'll try and answer them at the end. Let me start by introducing the panel to set the stage for our various perspectives. And I should say full bios for all the panelists are in the written CLE materials that you should have received. My name is Kevin Frankel. I'm a partner in the San Francisco office of McGuireWoods, and it's my honor to chair the State Attorney's General practice for the firm. Before joining McGuireWoods, I served under 3 administrations in the New York State Office of the Attorney General. This is a practice where there's usually 2 considerations at play. There's always the legal side and also the political side. We've got a group of over 50 professionals with a mix of litigators, regulatory lawyers, and public affairs consultants, with former senior staffers from attorney general offices across the country. And I should say we have active matters before nearly every state AG's office. I don't think we have anything in Guam at the moment, but we're pretty comprehensive. Next up, we've got Erin Ashwell. She's a partner at our Richmond office. She was the Chief Deputy Attorney General for Virginia under the last Democratic administration there. In that role, Erin was directly behind the AG in the line of succession and set legal strategy for more than 500 employees representing Virginia's executive agencies and the Joint State-Federal Medicaid Fraud Control Unit. She's the recipient of the National Association of Attorneys General Meritorious Service Award. Flipping to the other side of the political aisle, Bernie McNamee is a partner in the Richmond office, like Erin. And like Erin, Bernie was also the Chief Deputy Attorney General for Virginia, but under a Republican administration. He also held a senior role in the Texas Attorney General's office and was a commissioner on the Federal Energy Commission. In addition to his role at the law firm, Bernie is also a senior advisor with McGuireWoods Consulting. Next up, Mona Mohib works both at the federal level, particularly in the halls of Congress, as well as with Democratic governors and attorneys general across the country. She worked in the Clinton White House and Department of Labor in the Office of Intergovernmental Affairs, as well as serving as the Policy and Communications Director at the Democratic Governors Association. Mona leads the consulting side of our state AG practice for the Blue Team. Next up, Mike Reynolds is a senior vice president with McGuireWoods Consulting and also a partner at the law firm. Mike helps lead the firm's multi-state national practice for the Red Team, working with clients across the country who interact with governors, attorneys general, state legislators, and regulators. Before joining the firm, he worked in the Virginia governor's office as a state director on John McCain's presidential campaign and also on Capitol Hill. So he's also done the state and federal thing throughout his career. So we find that folks are often less familiar with the state landscape than what happens at the federal level. So I'm going to start by passing it off to Mike to give you a general overview of the field, and then we're going to pass it around and dig into some predictions for what's coming during Trump's second term from state AG land. So Mike, take it away, please.
Thank you, Kevin, and thanks for joining us today. We're going to set the table first and explain sort of what the landscape looks like politically across the country. Right now, you currently see 28 Republicans holding the Attorney General's office across the state and 22 Democrats. Most of these are elected positions, but there are some appointed. You see Hawaii, Alaska, American Samoa, New Jersey, New Hampshire, Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, and then wrapping out the list is Wyoming are appointed. In Maine, the Attorney General is elected by the legislature. And then there are some states where the AG is elected by the state Supreme Court. Most of the states do not have term limits. 33 of them do not have term limits. And then those that do have term limits, it's either 2 consecutive 4-year terms, or sometimes it's two terms over the course of that elected official's career. We did see 10 states with elections in 2024, and there are 6 new state attorneys general across the country. The biggest ones I'll point out, and we'll go into greater detail later on, the GOP flipped Pennsylvania. So Dave Sunday, he was a former a military veteran, and a York County prosecutor. So from that central portion of Pennsylvania, and he won the AG's race there. And then in Washington State, the first Black Attorney General of the state, Nick Brown, was elected, and he's big on a lot of environmental issues, consumer protection, and he spent more than $1.2 million in his victory, and still had about 300,000 cash on hand. So these are very expensive races as they move forward. I would say we think of our country, and as you can see by this breakdown, we are very much a 50-50 country. And that means there's just as many folks on the red team as there are on the blue team. However, a lot of these states, you see it in solidified as one party over another. So California and New York, obviously one side of the aisle. Texas and Florida are the other. And you don't see too many split legislatures. So looking at the places where there are, Minnesota, which actually has a power sharing agreement with the GOP House Speaker, and they're tied, and they were able to reach a no shenanigans handshake deal just a few weeks ago to get this power sharing arrangement. Michigan, where the Democrats control the Senate, the Republicans control the House, and in Pennsylvania, where you have a very closely divided state house. So a lot of these states are monolithically controlled, except for a few exceptions. Now, why is it important to know about state attorneys general in these offices? Well, a lot of times these folks hold lots of power, and they control a lot of things from consumer protection to weighing in on the constitutionality of issues. And then these individuals often go on to other offices of importance. Just look at the former Vice President Kamala Harris. She was the state attorney general in California. You have the current U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi. She's the Attorney General of the United States. She used to be the Florida Attorney General, and in fact, Florida AG Moody is now Senator Moody. She was just appointed by Governor DeSantis to move up. And so you've seen a lot of these folks hold a higher office. Walter Mondale was a state AG. Bill Clinton was a state AG. John Ashcroft was a state AG. And also everyone's favorite former Attorney General, Eliot Spitzer, was a state AG. So these positions not only hold significant power now, but these individuals are typically very ambitious, public service minded, and they have a lot more in their careers in store. So I would just say that these relationships that you can develop with these existing folks make a lot of sense long-term for your company's interests. And I would say that we're going to see a lot of these state AGs are hitting the ground running immediately. Like I said, there are 6 new attorneys general across the country. And a lot of these legislatures have begun work, and so they're weighing in on bills. When I worked for a former state AG in Virginia, this time was spent reviewing the constitutionality of the bills. They're looking at the financial impacts, and they are playing a role in them. And what we're seeing on a few things, I would say AI is a very hot topic. I was just at a Republican Attorney General conference a few weeks ago, and this was a major topic of discussion. We're also seeing environment, everything from landfills to energy usage. Those are major issues. And then always important, healthcare. And the state's top lawyer does play a role in all of these positions. They're consulted in the drafting, they're consulted in the review, and they often weigh in during these conversations. We're also seeing AI is continuing to be a major place, and the energy usages from that seems to be a place. One thing that I would suggest, and we've seen this as a staffer, and then also on the other side, working in the private sector for nonprofits, corporations, and other entities, folks like to build relationships before there's a problem. And what we've heard is these elected officials and their teams, they want to offer a spirit of collaboration and openness and transparency. And so it's always good to build relationships before you need it. Build the firehouse before you have the fire. And that predictability, showing that you are able to, you explain your business, explain how things run, and explain what you do that helps citizens, customers, consumers, that is often very much appreciated by these attorney generals and their teams. And this is the way for you to build those relationships on the front end, and that really helps down the road as they are looking at uh, possible places to either investigate or weigh in. You can be seen as a credible source for them as they're conducting the people's business. So with that, I'll turn it over to our next speaker.
I believe that's me. Well, thank you all for thank you for taking the time to be with us today. I want to talk a little bit about how I am thinking about what the next 4 years look like, based in part on the time that I spent in the Virginia Attorney General's office. And so when we first met to talk about this panel, my view was very much like, nothing's changed. I think one of the most significant states attorney generals are doing right now is bringing actions in the consumer protection space. A few areas that are kind of routinely bipartisan. So where you can see Texas and Virginia and Massachusetts all working together. And so my initial impression was that, not a lot is going to be different. I think my views have changed some over the last couple weeks. And so I want to start by just saying, when I was in the AG's office, what is the kind of thing that can spark an investigation? Because I think that's very useful maybe to some of the businesses that are joining us today, and kind of emphasizes what has stayed the same. Then I was going to talk just a little bit about if I were in an AG's office right now and thinking about how I'm going to deploy my resources, how my thinking would be changing with the news. And that may give us, take that as a conjecture as to what I think, what I expect right now over the next term. So the way that we would often decide to start an investigation when we are in the AG's office, I don't think is going to surprise you. One is if we saw something in the news that concerned us from a consumer protection basis, that we felt implicated our office's jurisdiction and presented a real problem for the people living in Virginia. And so one of the things that I try to tell people that I work with now that I'm in private practice is, when you see the news story and it's not the full story and you want to just shrug it off, there might be some value into doing some follow-up and correcting the record before it takes on a life on its own and results in a letter of inquiry. The other way would be consumer complaints. And so if you are in a business that's receiving a ton of consumer complaints, you should be mindful that for every person complaining to you, they're also very likely, particularly in consumer protection spaces, complaining to the Attorney General's office. And that's the kind of data that we would track to try to spot what we thought were potential violations out in the Commonwealth. And that would be something that could lead to an investigation. I think the last thing that I would sort of counsel people to be mindful of is what your business says about itself. So I don't know, and Kevin may want to speak to this, how many investigations we've had where there is a very fundamental misunderstanding about how a company works. And that's particularly the space, I think, for companies that are using technology to operate in a space that traditionally has not been online or has not been direct to consumer. And someone, early in the company's genesis will have put some description on Twitter or on Facebook or on the company's website that really doesn't explain how the company works. And it hits a regulator's desk, and you can spend thousands of dollars trying to undo what a marketing intern does over a summer. So those are the ways that a lot of investigations, especially in the consumer protection space, unfair practices, deceptive marketing, would come to our office. And I think that that's probably going to be consistent over the next 4 years. I think that is one of the spaces where the AGs have hit their stride. There's all kinds of news now about what's happening with the Consumer Financial Protection Board, the CFPB. And so I think it's likely that AGs step into that space, and that remains a bipartisan area. When I think now about what's changing, and if I were responsible for having to decide how to use the limited resources that any given state has, my thinking would be shifting some. I think it's likely that you see offices of attorney general stepping into spaces that have traditionally been controlled by federal regulators. So one, with some of the federal agencies being pulled back, I've already seen in the news, and you've likely seen it, that some states are going to argue that areas they were preempted in, they're no longer preempted in. So they can move forward in those areas. And I think we could see that in the environmental space. I think we could probably see it in some consumer protection spaces where there's been some form of national preemption. I think you could also see increased enforcement of areas that have traditionally been left to the federal government, but that states have been getting interested in getting involved in anyway. So I'm thinking principally right now of antitrust. We've seen a lot of states passing antitrust laws that are specific to certain subject matter areas. And then I think we could also see states trying to step in and fulfill the role of agencies that they think are being insufficiently active. So very often states have, under cooperative federalism, different opportunities to enforce federal environmental statutes. And I think you could see state agencies taking a more active role if they feel that the federal regulators are pulling back. So the messages are, I think, the same. Make sure that the public understands what you're doing. Listen to consumer complaints and have a strategy to deal with them before an attorney general's office decides to deal with them for you. But I think there are lots more reasons to have relationships now with your state regulators than you may have had in the past. And that's one of the biggest messages I think I'll be taking over the next 4 years.
All right, thanks, Erin. This is Bernie McNamee, and just teeing off on some of the things that you've heard already. I think it's important to think about the Attorney General's offices as they are inherently political, and that means that there's going to be opportunities to use that office to achieve political goals. That also means that for businesses that they're either going to be, as we've heard, subject to it, but it also may mean that they may be working with certain attorneys general. I think one of the key things that I think we've all noticed, regardless what side of the aisle we're on, is that the playbook, and I don't know who invented it, keeps getting passed back and forth between the Republican AGs and the Democratic AGs. And what you've seen is an alignment on certain issues where mainly Republicans will line up on something and Democrats line up on something, and it can be the same issue. So as a business, you need to think about, if you're subject to a multi-state action by a certain number of AGs, you may want to look to have another group of AGs intervene in the case and be active fighting for what your position is or for defending what you're trying to do. That can be difficult, but as we've talked about before, if you've developed some relationships and you're keeping track of what's going on, you may have an opportunity to do that. Now, I think some of the things to think about in certain areas, one is going to be financial. We've seen, especially during the Biden years, that there were a number of state AGs that took on various Wall Street banks and others in relation to their ESG investing, claiming that they were either engaged in an illegal boycott of certain industries, particularly fossil fuel, but also talking about debanking issues, which were it could be argued part of a culture war issue. So there's significant financial issues that are out there, and we anticipate that they're going to continue to happen during the next 4 years, especially with shifting issues coming out of Washington. But of course, there's going to be fundamental underlying issues. Of course, immigration is a big issue, but it's just not about immigration and deportation. It's going to be about businesses who are having to deal with compliance in terms of, are they making sure that they're checking for the proper identification for members? Are they dealing with the H-1B visas properly? And you may see states getting involved in these immigration issues, not just in relationship to the government activity, but also to businesses and how they're either hampering immigration policy or carrying it forward. In terms of energy, I think we're seeing that there's growing interest in attorneys general related to energy issues. Electricity is one area. We've seen, in particular, in Pennsylvania, the governor, with the AG's help, gained involved in PJM and their capacity market. But many AG's offices throughout the country have consumer counsel offices that participate in state public utility commission activities. And I think we're anticipating that that's still going to be something, especially as you're going to continue to have fights over renewable and clean energy goals, issues with land use with solar or wind, bringing in offshore cables. There's a variety of issues that could still go on and that AGs will probably play a role in. In terms of pharmaceutical issues and hospital issues are a perennial issue that, especially with Medicaid fraud offices that most AG's offices have. Remember, they get big press when they say that they've brought some action against some sort of Medicaid fraud. Technology, where you saw a number of states in the last few years bringing cases related to social media bans, and also consumer protection related to children and how certain technology, particularly apps used on people's phones, are targeting children and maybe hurting them. And so there's a number of bipartisan actions on that. I anticipate that that's going to continue. Then we also see on climate issues, we've seen a number of states who are using their state consumer protection laws, particularly deceptive advertising, to go after certain fossil fuel companies. And so now we've also seen, with those activities mainly by blue states against the fossil fuel companies, we've seen a bunch of red state AGs go after New York and other states for having a climate fund that they were going to use to basically extract money from those. So the bottom line is that regardless of whether or not the concern is we're just a business and we just want to do our business, because most businesses are regulated, most are subject to some form of economic regulation by the state and probably by the feds. That means is that you're going to have a concern with what state attorney generals are thinking about. And it's going to have to be, especially if you're in multiple states, you may have AGs that are on different sides of the same issue that's related to your business. And so it's very important to keep track of those and to make sure you're ahead of them. Mona?
Great. Thank you, Bernie. And thanks to everybody and for participating on our panel today. Just a couple of things. I mean, these folks are the best in the business and bring a perspective of having served in AG offices. So I rely on them a lot on the consulting side and partner very closely with our law firm on engaging on behalf of our clients. So the first thing I would say is it's important to build these relationships. As Aaron mentioned, the importance of building out long-term relationships with your regulators is even when there's nothing pressing. That's actually, in my opinion, the best time to build the relationships, because it's an opportunity for you to sort of tell the story of your company, why you're good corporate citizens, why your employees are involved in these communities. I think oftentimes there's an instinct, particularly when it really comes to regulators such as AGs, to maybe, I don't want to say put your head in the sand, but maybe sort of like, if I don't raise my hand, maybe I won't get picked on. But it's become very clear that it's important to build the relationships, because what's happening is if you're not telling your story, then certainly other people are. Your competitors, other folks in the industry may be at these same events where they're talking to regulators and so forth. And so it's important for you to proactively tell your story so that you don't find yourself sort of on your heels. Always harder to sort of push something back than sort of proactively move forward. So I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with folks who are like, a little anxious about it, but I think in the long term really builds nice relationships. It doesn't necessitate any kind of outcome at all. It just means that you've at least had the chance to tell the story. So for example, should you find yourselves on your heels a little bit, you're not starting from scratch in a very time sensitive manner. You've already laid the groundwork of telling everyone why you're good corporate citizens, why you're involved in these communities, and what you do to add value, and why, frankly, your company is part of the public policy toolkit, because lots of elected officials are trying to figure out how to best advance public policy. And there are oftentimes that companies themselves have the ability to present themselves as a public policy solution to elected officials. So having those relationships are really, really important. And there are a number of folks who are who don't choose to sort of be reactive and actually are very proactive and meet with their regulators, whomever those are, in virtually all 50 states, or certainly in the states where they do business. And over time, that allows for personal relationships too. So we definitely use that as a model, very much so. The other piece is, as Mike said, a lot of folks serve as AG, for example, for a very, very long time. But some use that as one part of their career, and often whether it's moving to the federal side, as Mike highlighted, or frankly, moving up to the governor's office. When folks find themselves in the governor's residence, it's often harder to build those relationships at that point because you're sort of further afield from them. But the AGs, there are many opportunities for you to build relationships with them so that if they happen to become governors, you've already have good precedent with them of building relationships. So certainly do that. And then particularly on the Democratic side, as Bernie said, I loved his line about the playbook moves back and forth. Oftentimes the playbook is the same. It just depends on who's, for example, sitting in the White House. So in the first Trump administration, we saw the Democratic AGs playing a very aggressive role, sort of viewing themselves as the backstop against what they might have called like egregious federal overreach. Things like the Muslim ban, other immigration-related issues were sort of top of mind. And then in the Biden administration, sort of the dynamic pivoted a little bit, where you saw more partnerships with Democratic AGs and an administration, whereas you saw perhaps a number of Republican AGs working together because accusing the Biden administration of federal overreach. So the playbook is almost the same. It really depends on sort of who's in the position. That said, and I'll defer to my colleagues that worked in AG's offices, I don't want to make this all partisan, because I do think there are definitely opportunities where AG offices, particularly in the consumer protection space, look to find themselves having the ability to work in a bipartisan way. I think because I'm on the public affairs side, there's sort of an instinct that it is more partisan. Absolutely not. And Mike and I work really closely together in a bipartisan way. And I think that it seems to me there's a number of consumer protection related issues where AGs really do look to try to work in a bipartisan way. But if I had to put my Democratic hat on, because Kevin asked me to, what I would say is, one, first, Democratic AGs are going to be mindful of where they view federal overreach, right? So where they think that what the federal government is doing is infringing on state sovereignty or sort of exceeds their federal government's constitutional authority. What they also are going to look to do is to protect state laws and regulations against federal preemption. And we saw that right after the election in November. A number of states, blue states, were calling for special sessions so that they could really protect some existing laws that they thought might be in jeopardy in sort of a new political climate post-November. As Aaron said, looking for enforcing consumer protection and antitrust laws, that'll be pieces that the Democratic AGs are looking at. And also safeguarding public health and safety issues, which includes protecting the environment, as Bernie raised. Data privacy, cybersecurity, but a particular piece that I think the Democratic AGs are going to look at is traditional civil rights, whether it's LGBTQ rights, voting rights, criminal, or if they're looking to, they're going to be sort of out front of the sphere. There are also state-specific that aren't partisan, so agriculture-related issues, specific economic challenges. I think we're going to see a lot of that going forward. But I think for me, as I think about it, the Democratic AGs have been preparing. Like, I don't think that President Trump getting elected was 100% a surprise to anyone. And because Democratic AGs have had the experience of the Trump administration, I think for a very long time, they've been anticipating what might happen should President Trump come back to office. There will have been 4 years of sort of preparation by supporters of the president of what a Trump second administration might look like. So I think the Democratic AGs this time have really prepared themselves. It doesn't make it easy what they have to accomplish in their minds, but I think they're trying to identify places where working together, they can protect the consumers and the citizens of their states against potential federal overreach, which may come in the next administration. So I'll leave it there for now. Kevin, toss back over to you.
Thanks, Mona. And going last, I already agree with all my learned colleagues here, but I'll try and cover some new material. So I do agree that on the consumer protection side, a lot may not change. Republican and Democratic attorneys general will work together on consumer protection issues like bank fraud, data breaches, the like. And many of those issues are handled at the less political line assistant level, and they don't really bubble up necessarily to the C-suite, if you will, where the political heads make the decisions. I do think it's worth touching on the CFPB, since there's been a fair amount of chaos over there in the last week. So I ran a bunch of stats and pulled some of the cases which are in your written materials. I'm sure you've all read them already. I know it's over 600 pages, but so much is happening so quickly at the CFPB that I had to redo my notes even this morning. So I think that attorneys general may team up less with the CFPB than they did under the Biden administration. But just to put a worm in your ear about it, last Trump term, so Trump's first term, there were 48 enforcement actions brought by the CFPB. And there were more under Trump's last year than there were under Biden's last year. And the reason we look at the last year is there was sort of a changeover in enforcement directors, and also when you have an outgoing administration, people tend to try and jam through their cases and do what they're going to do. So I think there were like 20 more cases in Trump's last year than in Biden's. So there's some reason to believe that the CFPB will survive this latest round of attacks, and once it gets rolling again, will actually bring cases. I think that the difference we're going to see is we'll probably be seeing less partisan cases. We'll be seeing more bread and butter fraud rather than some of the more exotic stuff we've seen under Democratic presidents. So traditional law enforcement, there's no reason to think that states won't still team up with the CFPB on these sorts of matters. Yes, we've seen a lot of blue state collaboration with the CFPB historically, but they've also partnered with South Carolina and Florida and a whole host of red states. So we'll see if the CFPB survives. Smarter heads than mine predict that it will. But when the dust settles, perhaps we'll start seeing those collaborations pick up again. I think we're going to see state AGs potentially getting away from fighting over non-competes and some of that culture war type stuff that does affect the business community, and get into more run-of-the-mill, people were just clearly defrauded, and it's not a red-blue issue anymore. And the elephant in the room, of course, Democratic AGs are going to be suing Trump left, right, and center. But that's not really going to affect the private sector as much as it's going to affect the news cycle. DOJ is going to be on the other side of those cases. It's not going to be, an AG versus insert your Fortune 500 company. we expect that the private sector is largely going to be on the sideline for some of those battles. Not that it won't affect how those companies have to do business. If immigration gets a workforce, that's going to have consequences. If environmental regulations are changed, that may change the cost structure for a business and compliance. But there may be less of a focus on suing the businesses directly, and it might be more state taxpayer dollars versus federal taxpayer dollars, and we'll see how it shakes out. California is sort of one of the larger AG's offices. It's actually the largest law firm in the country, I think, by overall numbers. New York would be the second largest AG's office, and we see those two very active on the blue side, along with Massachusetts, DC. California particularly is going to be going hard on the Trump administration. They've devoted $10 million to hiring line assistants to fight the Trump agenda. And that's really separate and apart from, they've already got a Consumer Protection Bureau. They've already got an Environmental Bureau, land use management. They're going to keep doing all the work they've been doing, but this is sort of a tack on. And for those of you in private practice or at large companies, you may think, well, $10 million doesn't go a whole long way in litigation, which is true in private practice. But when you're hiring line assistants at a couple $100,000 a pop gets you a year's worth of a litigator. $10 million is a fair amount of trouble you can stir up. So we'll see what happens there. I think you're also going to see those states with a lot of other follow-ons, Oregon, Rhode Island, et cetera, plugging some gaps in federal legislation. Car emissions, clean air is a huge issue in California. I don't think that California is going to lay down on that one easily, even if there's a federal preemption issue, they're going to fight it out. Clean water, species preservation, the Migratory Bird Act. I think all this is going to become sort of a state issue. The energy sector is going to be a toughie for blue state AGs because there's strong federal preemption issues there. I think FERC, PHMSA. But blue states are going to try, especially if they've got pressure on the political front from blue state voters who are looking at crumbling federal environmental regulations and saying, you got to stand up and do something in the governor's office, in the state AG's office. How successful those will be, remains to be seen. And some of that's going to depend on how well the federal administration crafts laws and whether they use Congress or they go through executive orders. There can be some different implications there for how much it preempts the state field. So I think if the Trump administration starts leveraging Congress, and again, as a reminder, if you have been under a rock for the last year, Republicans control the House, the Senate, and the presidency. So if they want to pass legislation, they have narrow margins, but in the middle of the party, they ought to be able to get some legislation done. Expect that to raise some major hurdles for blue state AGs who want to fight these battles. Abortion access is going to certainly be a front and center issue. We've already seen some federal legislation percolating up to federally ban abortion. There's some backdoor attempts as well that are a little sneakier. The blue states are going to draw a line to the sand. They're going to fight that one real hard. And how that's going to affect folks on the private sector side, hospitals, and particularly we're seeing state AGs on the red and blue sides flexing new antitrust powers to do reviews of mergers in the healthcare space that affect their states. And blue states, like Oregon was kind of pioneering in this space, will take a hard look at, say, if a Catholic charity is taking over a local hospital system, if private equity, maybe out of Texas, is taking over a local hospital system. Is there going to be a shift in services that are provided? Will women still have access to abortion? Will they still have access to morning after pills? Will they still have access to birth control? Or will some of those systems be shut down in hospitals that used to provide them? Watch for blue states to be blocking on those grounds. and watch for red states to be concerned about access issues, particularly in rural portions of the state. Indiana is starting to get in on this game, but Illinois has also been very active. It's a little less partisan when it comes to the access issues, and it frequently comes up when folks in private equity are buying hospital systems, dental practices, medical practices, and sometimes when you look at the dollars and cents, it makes sense to shut down a center that maybe isn't particularly profitable. But state AG is, answering to the constituents in those areas, maybe loath to see folks have to drive 100 miles to get to the nearest hospital, and so they'll use their parents' pay trade powers to try and protect access, and will extract penalties in the context of those mergers. And it's important when you're navigating hospital merger issues, as I know some of you are. Make sure you understand what the state's powers are. These antitrust laws vary a lot state to state. Some of them, it's really just a notice provision where the state gets 30 days to comment on it, essentially, but they don't have a lot of power to block it. Other states, it's very strong, and if the deal isn't palatable, you're going to be in a world of hurt. So that's a good place to get some advice from counsel. In terms of ESG, I know that's been a hot button issue for a lot of folks. We've been advising some clients in the area that you're going to be between a rock and a hard place. The EU is continuing to push on what's essentially ESG requirements. California, there's a state law requiring California-based companies to diversify their corporate boards and to have at least one woman on the board, et cetera. Some of these regulations are going to come into conflict with federal laws very quickly, or executive orders. One of the things to get around it, we saw that the federal administration was sort of governing by Control F with diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some of you may have noticed that a Department of Commerce unit was shut down because it had equity in the name, even though it had to do with bank equity, like holding sufficient funds. It had nothing to do with DEI. One of the ways to potentially get around some of this is, if you've got an ESG program, call it something else. Call it sustainability, or if that becomes a bad word too, you can get creative. But I mean, the rubber is going to hit the road on some of this eventually, and it'll take some deft navigating to get between the feds, the states, and foreign entities also, to the extent you're doing business internationally. I want to make sure I don't go too long here because we have a bunch of questions and I want to get them to the panel. But one quickie, because there's another big ticket item that I think we're going to be seeing activity from red and blue states. That's PFAS, forever chemicals. And to give you some stats, as of December 2024, which seems a very long time ago, but I assure you it was less than 2 months, over half of states had litigation against PFAS chemical manufacturers. It was, I think, 30 states plus DC. And it spanned the political spectrum. You got Arkansas, Arizona, California, Connecticut, Colorado, I think Delaware settled, DC, Hawaii, Illinois, Indiana, Maine, Massachusetts. I think there were settlements in Mississippi and New Jersey, Ohio. But again, more is going on in Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, Texas, Tennessee, Washington. I mean, it goes on. And those claims can include water and drinking water contamination, contamination of other natural resources like cattle and ranch areas, getting into the animals, getting into the feed. And there's, efforts to get remediation. There's huge cost to upgrade wastewater treatment and other facilities that the states are trying to stick private industry with. So this is something to keep an eye on in state AG land. And again, unfortunately, PFAS have made their way into almost everything. So for any kind of manufacturing business, there's some potential liability here. And to give you a sense of it, there have been funds and plans set up to assist farmers. And I think one of those funds, including medical monitoring, was 70 million just in Maine alone. So these are going to be huge financial tickets for some folks. It's touching food packaging, carpets, rugs, upholstered furniture, oil and gas products, apparel, firefighting foam, cleaning products, cookware, dental floss, feminine hygiene, children's products, cosmetics. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. So anyway, just wanted to flag that, and also the states that are partnering sometimes with private businesses to go back up chain to manufacturers from the retailer basically suing the manufacturer. So if I was going to predict something that is going to continue kind of unfazed by the change in the administration, I think that's a big one. Okay, so I see there's a bunch of questions in the box, so I'm going to wind myself down here. And I think the first one we've got was on Mafuku. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, the Medicare fraud units at state AG's offices are a state-federal partnership, and it's funded generally by both sides. Aaron, do you want to talk about that, or did somebody else want to jump in? What's going to happen in that space?
I'd be happy to talk about it. Thank you. And other, others, please feel free to jump in. But we were incredibly proud in Virginia. We call it MIFQ, of our MIFQ unit. And it is an extremely successful partnership between the federal government and the state government that looks for kind of waste, fraud, and abuse, often involving criminal charges, and sometimes, really implicating interests of very vulnerable individuals. Some of the worst cases that you see come under investigations are where maybe certain health practices are happening not for medical reasons, but because they have high reimbursement rates, right? So this is a very successful state and federal partnership that happens, I believe, in every single state AG's office. It will be really interesting to see how that moves forward and whether the priorities for those prosecutions change. They have traditionally been bread and butter prosecutions. Some of them touched on opioids. You all probably followed the news about the opioid litigation that the state AGs brought against opioid distributors and manufacturers. But by and large, they're bread and butter prosecutions that kind of hit at core non-political acts. So if the federal government pulls back on the funding on that, I think states are going to struggle to support it. If the prosecutorial objectives change and focus more on something like the president's executive orders, I think you could see some of the cooperation between states and those offices break down. And that's really uncharted territory, because at least in Virginia, our office did a lot of the core investigations. We had some federal prosecutors who are actually employed by the state, right? It was a true partnership. And if that partnership breaks down, I just don't know what it looks like. It may, in fact, lead to less enforcement, but it could also lead to just less predictable enforcement. And I think that would be a big concern, for those on this call. Mike, did you want to speak to that as well?
Yeah.
I would just add that Attorney General, state AGs, often the joke is that AG actually means aspiring governor. And never underestimate, as Bernie suggested, that this is an inherently political office in most of the states it's elected. And these are folks who are ambitious. And so with a Medicaid fraud unit, this is a particular area where folks can recover money for the state. They can put bad guys away and help consumers and constituents a lot of times who are really in need. So this is a great area for folks to work. So I would just say that because of that ability to recover money and also get headlines, this is a place where the AGs want to be. And so even though there may be some other places where interjurisdictional collaboration may not work out, the Dodd-Frank enforcement, child online privacy protection, this is a place where I would see a lot of very robust action from Republicans and from Democrats. I would also just go back. We had a question about ESG and DEI, and I think Kevin answered that very well about ways that folks can look at that, particularly from the Democratic perspective. From the Republican side, what I would say is a lot of the state AGs and their senior staffs that I've spoken with over the years in talking about this issue, many companies have to work in both red states and blue states. They have to work across the country, and these DEI policies cut both ways. And so some on the left are very animated, and some on the right are very animated about this. And what we found is that by sitting down and talking to these AGs themselves with their senior staffs, sitting down with them on the front end and just asking them how would they help with, how do they see this? What do they recommend you do? And having those conversations in small, intimate settings, that tends to really help give you guidance. And sometimes their perspective is different than where the company is, but a lot of times you can find common ground. It's the ability to talk about all the community efforts that you do, all the efforts that you do to help promote employees, and what you're looking for, and what your what your company values are. And by sitting down and having those conversations, a lot of times you can educate those senior policy officials on what you're trying to accomplish, and maybe get some insights and suggestions on what they're thinking on the front end. I would say I took down some notes from a recent conversation that we had, where the senior official in one of the state AG's offices in the South said, "We're not trying to hurt your companies and your clients. We just want to make sure that the rights of our prospective constituencies are protected, and so that when you come to us on the front end, it is hugely beneficial to us to be able to advise you on how to avoid litigation and investigations with us, and how to respect what we are trying to do, which is protect rights. And the wrong way to do it is to wait until we come and knock on your door." So I think that's just something that reinforces what Mona has said, what Aaron and Kevin and the other panelists have all said, which is dialogue and communication. Kind of open up and share what your thinking is, and that can lead to positive results and the right outcomes.
Yeah, and Mike, that's a great point. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Mike and Mona doing some lobbying may save millions on the Aaron and Kevin side of the beat. But go ahead, Mona, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I was just going to say, just to tag on to what Mike was saying, also you have to anticipate that people have long memories. And so if you have positioned your company in one place, and then you sort of have quickly pivoted the other, I don't think it's, and I'll defer to Aaron and others, I don't think it's lost on people. So it did feel like, I think, just in a bunch of the meetings that I've been in over the years, particularly after George Floyd and a number of the incidents that happened during COVID, there was very much a sense that companies really were proud of the work they were doing in D&I and really wanted to showcase that to elected officials. And if you find yourself sort of, as a company, sort of pivoting a bit, be mindful that people do know what your history is too. And so it's always, I think, as Mike said, having thoughtful conversations to sort of share your perspective is very important, because if all one might see is you couldn't tell us enough about how committed you were, and then all of a sudden, if we ask you to participate in a panel or something else, it's sort of crickets. That almost, in a way, sort of piques the interest also. I'm speaking on the D side, it would be notable too. So just thoughtful about how, when you're working with your company on these issues that are complicated and sort of unintended consequences, or try to anticipate looking around the chessboard on what the perception might be, even if it wasn't intended on your part. Thank you.
Good points. And we've got a question about the FTC. So we talked a little bit about the CFPB and Chopra, obviously, out very recently. Lena Khan, I haven't checked in this morning. Last I heard, she's still hanging in there, but I think the sense is she may be on borrowed time, and the FTC may be on some borrowed time. Any predictions from the panel on what's going to happen with the interactions between state AGs and the FTC? Oh, Bernie, we can't hear you.
I'll start on that one. Obviously there's been shifting perceptions on antitrust, and even among Republicans, perhaps even among some Democrats, and it seems to be focused almost based on what is the business involved and what are their politics, so to speak, that drives an interest. There were a lot of Republican AGs and other elected officials who were very upset with big tech, big data, and wanted to engage in perhaps using antitrust laws, even at the state level, to take them on. Now, of course, a number of the big tech folks are participating in the Trump administration, so there might be some shift on attitudes on that. All shifting. Now, in terms of how the FTC is going to work and the DOJ's antitrust division, I think the standard lawyers are going to be focused on the standard analyses, but I do think that there's going to be some real thinking about some of the more innovative ideas that Chairman Khan has proposed, and there's going to be, though, AGs are going to still be looking for ways to use the antitrust laws in order to achieve their other kind of policy goals. We talked about it a little bit earlier, on fossil fuel issues. How is ESG being used to hurt certain fossil fuel companies? How is big data being used with children, and are they going to be able to use antitrust aspects for that? So, I think there's not a monolithic new view of antitrust. It's not like, former Justice Bork or Judge Bork, when he was, the antitrust paradox and got everybody rethinking. I think there's a developing thought leadership on both sides, but trying to figure out, is it really policy driven about what's the right antitrust policy, or is it outcome based of who do we like and who do we not like, and who do we want to not be able to grow or to dominate an industry? And I think that's going to be the big challenge for everybody, and why it's going to be important to be engaged in trying to think through your business, especially if you're going to engage in some sort of merger or acquisition, is, how are you going to navigate that? And what's the narrative going to be about your company as it grows? And how are different AGs going to perceive that, let alone how the FTC or DOJ will look at it?
Thanks, Bernie. I think we maybe have room for one last question. We've got a bunch here, so I'm going to try and combine some and see if we can squeeze it in. So we've got a question about priorities and what areas maybe AGs might walk away from. I think we've also got some questions about what the priorities are going to be. I'll take a piece of it and then I'll kick it to the panel. So last year, the president of the National Association of Attorneys General was Ellen Rosenblum of Oregon, and her priority was social media and its adverse impacts on children. So Meta was a big focus, having restrictions and protecting data, things like that. He was incoming in December. Now he's in president of the National Association this year. It always flips from Democrat to Republican and back again. So we've got a Republican, it's New Hampshire AG, John Formella. His priority is opioids. So we've done opioids before, billions in dollars in opioid litigation and settlements. So expect another chapter of that. In terms of what's going to go away, what do you guys think? What are we not going to see in the coming year?
Well, I think it's going to be less what's not coming, but what's going to be the shift. And we've touched a little bit on that. I think one of the big things is going to be environmental regulation. When I was at the Texas AG's office, and President Obama was in office, and then, it was sue the administration every day, and it was almost based always on environmental laws. Of course, that then picked up again under the Biden administration from Texas and West Virginia and others. But I think what you're going to see is you know, you're not going to see the same sort of work from the AGs in terms of challenging new environmental laws that are going to be restrictions on businesses. But what you might see is blue state AGs in particular trying to use their own powers for environmental enforcement or to somehow force mandamus out of EPA or others to regulate. And I think, you know, that's what kind of one of the major changes is going to be, especially environmental.
We could go on. There's more questions, but I see folks dropping, and I know we're over time. So thank you to the panelists. It's been a fantastic conversation. To the attendees, thank you everyone for coming out. I know folks do have more questions and we can keep chatting. Please feel free to reach out to any of us. We love to talk about this stuff. We're happy to schmooze. And we'll be in touch. So thanks all for joining us.
Thank you.